Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining this afternoon. And thank you especially to Leslie and Nicholas for joining so early. Despite their travels, they could make some time. And thank you also to the two panelists that we have here. So today's topic is, of course, about the US elections. We're at an interesting juncture with less than 50 days left for the US elections in early November. And almost every day there are developments that really uh, uh, bring or usher unpredictability in the mix. So it's really important. We're also living in an age of a new political polarization, where gun violence is being debated in a different light, and both parties are scrambling to sort of recalibrate their position on issues like gun control, or let me put it this way, on issues that they have traditionally been differently positioned. So recalibrations are something that we're looking at very carefully. Role of independence has been an important factor in this election. We have seen Kennedy's shift to Trump's camp and what that could mean for the elections. Immigration is one of the biggest issues facing the US electorate. Especially in the debate, as we saw, it came out in different light than we expected, but nonetheless, it created a lot of furor, especially uh, especially the points that Donald Trump had to make. Misinformation in social media has come out in a new light in this election. I mean, already there is the angle of an Iranian threat that the U.S. intelligence agencies have cautioned Trump with. So I think there is a lot to unravel today. We have a fantastic panel who will help us do that. So let me what the way in which I thought this will go is probably I'll ask each one of you to make an opening remarks, and then I'll cue in my questions there. And so let me first ask Suhasini, Haidar, to make her comments about how does you look at the U.S. elections, and what does it mean for India? What does it mean for U.S.'s relations, important relations such as India, China, and particularly what does it mean for the Indo-Pacific should a Trump administration come in or a Harris administration should come in? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Vivek, and thank you to ORF for organizing this. We're still very early because it seems as if in US politics, particularly with campaign 2024, that you just have to blink and there'll be another few game-changing sort of developments, and you'll have to recalibrate very quickly what you're expecting on November 5th. But having said that, I do have to say there is a certain silence in India, or if you like, an ease in India with the campaign progressing in the United States, simply because I don't think India is an issue. Maybe it's been mentioned once or twice, and it is very clear that we are enjoying a 25th year of year-on-year improvement in India-US bilateral ties that have cut across every kind of government in India and every kind of government in the US. So in 25 years, we've seen every kind of combo between the governments, and yet what we do see is a secular growth in the relationship and in the areas in which the two are engaging with each other. So I think there's a general complacency. I'll get to the specifics of the two candidates in just a bit, but I think there's a general understanding that regardless of who does come to power, we're looking at another 4 years of improvement in US-India ties. Somebody once said to me that US-India ties have, over the last 25 years, not necessarily improved as dramatically every year. We still, even today in 2024, are talking about the nuclear moment and what the civil nuclear deal did for India-US ties. But they have always gone forward, sometimes more slowly than others, but we haven't actually seen them roll back at all in this period. And that's a fairly sizable amount of time to be able to study the variables in this phenomenon. The other thing we can say as Indians who are very proud of our diaspora is that no matter who wins, there'll be someone of Indian origin either in the White House or in Blair House. So we feel quite well represented, shall we say, with whoever does come to power. I know that we're going to leave time for a proper discussion later, so I will get to the specifics. I do think that basically the Trump campaign and the Harris campaign have shown that they are not, neither of them see India as a threat, neither of them see India as a challenge. The current Biden administration also sees India as a part of the solution to global challenges. So it's a comfortable position there. There are, I would say, 6 issues where if I were to put everything else aside, and of course Ambassador Shankar is here and our other panelists can speak a little bit more perhaps on the kind of improvements we expect when it comes to defense, when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, when it comes to technology, what the GE 414 jet engine technology transfer will mean for the India-US relationship. I think these are all areas where we are agreed that things will move quickly, or will move positively. But because today what we are discussing is how to embrace the uncertainty, if you like, I wanted to flag the sort of 6 or 7 issues where I think it will depend on who is the winner in November as to how India-US relations go forward on those. The first is no doubt trade. Just last week, we heard from Mr. Trump making, it seemed, a premature announcement that he would be meeting Prime Minister Modi in the US. That did not happen. Mr. Modi didn't meet either candidate, in fact, but he did also in the same statements call India the big abuser. I think what that comment does is reminds us that Mr. Trump has not forgotten his experience, or what he felt was his experience with India when it came to trade. Therefore, there will be a difference going forward as well. There are some obvious differences between them. Mr. Trump did try very hard for a free trade agreement between India and the US. At the same time, he... Not for a free trade agreement. Sorry, for a limited preferential trade agreement. But that was a focus for, I think, 3 of the 4 years he was in office. But there were tariffs on India, and perhaps took the most negative step that someone has taken in the last few years, and that was to withdraw India's GSP status. As far as Ms. Harris is concerned, she's not likely to take those kind of tough measures against India, but we may see her take tough measures on other respects. When it comes to the relationship with China, and I think this is something we're all watching, because China has become the elephant in the room when it comes to US-India ties. The US has become the elephant in the room when it comes to India-China ties. So we have to watch this triangle very carefully. I think what we are expecting to see with Ms. Harris is a certain continuity of the Biden administration's very sort of tough talking on China geopolitically, strategically, taking forward the Quad in a perhaps more purposeful way, but also taking non-Quad organizations, arrangements in the Indo-Pacific, which are actually militaristic in nature. So whether it is dealing with AUKUS, whether it is dealing with America's treaty allies like Japan in the region, or whether it is dealing with the idea of Quad Plus, which are countries that have military agreements with the US, we've seen much more movement in this era, but it is quite likely that Mr. Trump will be equally tough. Of course, his toughness with China is likely to be much more in the economic sphere. The relationship of the Trump administration to China geopolitically yet remains to be seen, because I think unlike the last time, we are not going to see as much uncertainty when it comes to the Trump administration's choices. I think they are going into this election with the idea that they're going to win. It's not going to be a surprise if they win. I'm not saying they will win. I'm just saying they will not be surprised if they win. And they already have a team in place of sorts. And we're already hearing from some of the members who are outlooked to be in that team. It may be a little transactional. You know, there's urban legend about the idea that Mr. Trump got on a plane in Singapore after he was meeting with the North Korean leader. And he was told by his advisors that the US military had just renamed the PACOM, or Pacific Command, as the Indo-PACOM. And his first response to that was, and what are we getting from India in return for that? And the reason why it is so much a part of that urban legend is because it reminds us that it is likely to be a transactional exercise. Remember how Trump has in his time. And it's so nice because with both these leaders, we can pretty much tell you a lot of what is in their policy because we've lived it for the last 8 years. So you see, with Mr. Trump holding NATO to account, wanting even Japan and South Korea to pay up if they wanted US protection, you are likely to see some of that transactional seep back in to the US engagement, if you like, with China, the Indo-Pacific, and these issues. On Russia, Ukraine, I think if Mr. Trump wins, New Delhi is looking to maybe breathe a slight sigh of relief simply because the kind of relentless pressure we have seen from the Biden administration and as a result, European countries on India to cut its ties with Russia. I think Trump will probably take his foot off the gas on that one. He has said he wants to end this war very quickly. I'm not sure if he is able to do that, but it certainly will be a very different tack from if Ms. Harris remains in power. She has been very committed to stepping up support for Ukraine. I don't know how much that will translate in terms of money, but in terms of what Mr. Zelensky is asking for now, those clearances to use both US and European equipment from NATO countries, which needs US clearance for long-range missile strikes inside Russia, is likely to change the complexion of this war. And Ms. Harris is certainly expected to be more open to that idea than Mr. Trump would be, but it certainly remains to be seen if either would. So I've gotten through 3 issues. There's climate change, where it doesn't need to be told Mr. Trump will be pushing for India to up its fuel imports from the US, probably pushing for a deal like the Tellurian one, which was announced with a lot of fanfare at the Howdy Modi event in 2019, but subsequently the deal was shelved for India to invest in an LNG facility there in Louisiana. Whereas Ms. Harris is going to be much more on India's climate goals and trying to assist India perhaps in its green transition. On the subject of immigration, I don't think either is going to be a lot easier, but Mr. Trump is going to be tougher on both legal and illegal immigration from India. There are very few groups that Mr. Trump spared during his time as president in terms of the quotas and the numbers that he allowed in. And certainly the rhetoric is expected to get that much more harsh if he were to come to power. And finally, when it comes to the subject of human rights, democracy in decline, NGOs in trouble, transnational repression, we are likely to hear a lot more from a Harris administration of the kinds that India has faced even just a few days before Mr. Modi went to the US last week. Then we are expected to hear from Trump, if at all we hear from him on those issues. Should I stop over here and we can always come back to the discussion?
Thank you, Suhasini, for an excellent roundup of what I would see as a set of expectations from New Delhi. And given the fact that Mr. Trump has been in power in the past, and there are also some expectations on the Harris government, a potential Harris government side, because she's been part of the Biden-Harris administration. So I think there are some cues to draw in. So thank you for rounding that up. Let me now move to Nicholas. Sitting in DC, I think it would be fascinating to hear what are the key issues that are driving the election sentiments right now. I know I wouldn't ask you to predict, but feel free to do so. It's an extremely tight race with places like Omaha and Nebraska becoming so important right now for both the candidates. So over to you. How does this look at this point? Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Mishra and Observer Research Foundation, for this opportunity to talk to you this morning. You're right. This is in this year of elections, this is a historic election. It's a very important election here in the United States, and the attention is getting tighter and tighter on all of these issues and all of these kind of key areas across the United States that will impact the election. And so kind of looking at it, there's often a zooming in on particular issues and then a zooming out on some more of the broader issues. And kind of three areas is the election themselves, the partisanship that we have here in the United States, and then in particular for our conversation, the foreign policy aspect of this election. So when you zoom in, it's like we talked about, it's the swing states, the 7 in particular, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, and Nevada. And so how these tight races in these states, and you'll see on election day, you'll see the TV pundits literally zooming in on the districts on their TV screens and on their smart screens as they try and refresh and get the latest vote tally. Key issues they'll be zooming in on, like we talked about, the economy, those job issues, those inflation issues, the ability to pay for housing, the ability to pay for your education or your kids' education, and technology and artificial intelligence and that aspect in the economy and how that involves with jobs. Immigration, like you talked about, a huge issue, more of a top talking point for the Republicans than the Democrats, but still a huge issue that is talked about, and then again in Arizona in particular. Healthcare, climate change, all these things are going to be kind of zoomed in on and focused in on to see, especially in those swing states, how they move people to vote. Zooming in again on the key voters when we look at these states, the women vote, as you talked about, the Asian American vote, and those in the Indian diaspora will be looked at in particular because of how it's been voting the past couple of elections. Those will be those key areas too that'll be zoomed in on. And then in particular here in Washington, D.C., mainly because our vote is usually kind of for the Democrats in the presidential side, and then Maryland and Virginia next to us are locked in, almost locked in for the president's side, will be the House and the Senate. So focusing on the House and the Senate and how those races turn out and will impact how the next president will be able to interact with Congress. And when you zoom out from all of those, you're going to look at what will the next president be able to do? Will they be able to implement what they've talked about, what they've promised, and will they do what they said they wanted to do? And as Ms. Haidar mentioned, we've had experience with President Trump and what he wants to do and what he wants to try to do and what he's done, and with kind of the Biden-Harris policies and what they've tried to do. So that's kind of zooming out there. The partisanship, the second one, that's a huge thing. That's impacting, as you zoom in, kind of impacting almost every aspect of our society. You see it in our education talks about what books we should have in our kids' schools, what we should be teaching our kids about the history of the United States and the importance of our history, how to deal with jobs in our local areas, how to deal with crime in our local areas, how our local governance is able to interact and to implement ways to help out the local areas. All these things are just jam-packed with partisan issues and partisan fighting. And then kind of zooming out from there, it's again, how does that bleed into what the president can do, and what the Congress can, and what the Congress is going to do with the United States and with all these issues as we're talking about. And how does that partisanship impact the functioning of the United States and its ability to address these issues internally and then respond to these key changes and dynamics in the international community. The last aspect is the foreign policy aspect. For us at the East-West Center, we have an election report coming out next month where we're looking at Asia's views of the U.S. election. My colleagues, Robert Sutter from George Washington, my boss, Dr. Satu Lemay, the vice president of East West Center, and myself are writing this report. We went around Asia. We've talked to people in Asia and trying to get their views of what's going to happen. But here in the United States, foreign policy is not a big issue in the election itself. The main three areas are Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, and China. And so it's how the US and the next president will try to address those three. And for China in particular, it seems that the China issue also seems to impact other issues more so than the Ukraine issue or Israel-Palestine. So you have the economy and China and the economy and jobs, China and immigration, with some of the reports that Chinese were coming in through the southern border. You have energy and climate change, how we deal with that, and how we work with China on energy and climate change, or how we are critical of China and its energy and climate change policies. AI and technology and China's ability to impact those areas. And then the foreign policy overall, where China is such a huge issue, even though there's bipartisan support on China being a competitor, China being an issue, and concern about China's growth and ability to make sort of these incursions and into gray zone areas for multiple different countries across Asia. And all these issues really are part of that China issue itself. So the China issue is a big one in foreign policy, even though foreign policy is a smaller aspect of that foreign policy and electoral conversation. So those are the kind of three main areas I want to talk to you about in the beginning, about the elections and how when we zoom in on these key issues, they're important aspects of the election themselves and who will be the next president. And then as we zoom out, what that next president will be able to do. So I hope that's a good start, and I look forward to more of the conversation.
Thank you. If I can quickly follow up before moving to Ambassador Shankar, is how is it, how do you perceive the changing nature of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party itself? I mean, if you zoom in both the parties, there's a great degree of individualization. So inside the Trump camp, the RNC, you hardly had anybody present from the traditional Republican Party, while in the DNC, in the Democratic National Convention, you had everybody present. But on the other hand, you had just a few days ago a Biden standing alone and not willing to give up his seat, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, but it was the party pressure that allowed eventually Biden to step out. So, there's a changing, and on specific issues, as I said, for instance, on the issue of abortion right, you see the Republican Party sort of gravitating towards being more Democrat than Republican. So on key issues like this, how do you assess the change in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and what does it mean for the election in terms of swaying voter sentiment?
Sure. I think one of the key aspects of that is the sort of base and strongly vocal aspects of the party, each of those parties. And so for the Republicans, it is sort of right now the Donald Trump supporters and people who have kind of fallen in line with Donald Trump in order to support him and get him reelected. For Biden-Harris, that kind of progressive wing, and to see if the progressive wing will have even more vocal sway with Harris as she kind of establishes herself, and then even more so as she's elected. So I think those are the key aspects of the parties themselves and how those vocal bases and vocal areas of support of those parties push the candidates the presidential candidates in particular, and then as you trickle down to the Senate, House, and governors, even more focused in on that. Those are where you're seeing that. And the elections kind of highlight those as you get toward the election, and then the aftermath of the wins and losses of election day, and how that kind of the fallout from there, and where then who is in power after the elections.
Also, interesting that you pointed out the Senate race. I think that's one of the key aspects to look out for. There are 34 seats up for grab, and that could change the election one way or the other. But moving on to Ambassador Meera Shankar, what's your assessment going less than 50 days into the US election, and what could the next administration mean for India-US relations broadly, by US foreign policy in this area?
Firstly, let me say that I am as confused as the Americans about the likely outcome of the election. It's very tight. The race is very tight, and it keeps shifting week to week. I suppose what one could say is that the momentum has been with Kamala, because she has made up the ground that Biden had lost. He was way behind Trump. And in some polls, she's shown as ahead of Trump. They are tied in some polls, and in some polls, she's shown as ahead. And in recent weeks, her, the polls which average all the polls are showing her lead as increasing, anywhere between 3 to 6%. And some are showing her as having a 1% lead. So most of them are showing her as ahead in the national polls. But the national polls may not matter, because finally it's going to come down to the 7 swing states, as we saw with Hillary, who got 3 million more popular votes than Trump, but got fewer seats in the Electoral College, so because she didn't win the swing states. So we could see a repeat of that here, because the swing states are really, really tight. And again, the latest polls show that they are tied in several of the swing states. Trump may be ahead in perhaps 2, and Kamala is ahead. So it's in 1 or 2. And again, by just about like Trump by 2 percentage points, Kamala by 1 percentage point. So well within the margin of error in the swing states. Now, what are the 2 constituencies that these 2 candidates represent? Because the US has never been so polarized as it is today. On the one hand, you see Trump, who has a very solid support base, which has not eroded. But he has not been able to increase it either. And the race is really going to be for the middle ground. Who gets the undecideds? Who gets the independents? And those who are middle of the road, who haven't yet made up their minds. With Trump, his support has, you see both gender and race playing out in terms of the constituencies of the 2 candidates. So white males overwhelmingly support Trump, though university-educated white males may also to some degree support Kamala. Then you see a rural-urban divide, where rural America, which is not so diverse, primarily and at some level feels they are a left-behind hinterland, support Trump. And the urban centers, which are more diverse, and the coastal regions, which look out more towards the world, which are not so insular, support the Democrats. Now, the swing states, the blacks support Kamala, Hispanics too, she has a majority, though in Florida, the Hispanics support Trump because they are Cuban Americans, conservative traditionally. And then Kamala has also got, I think, the majority of the women's vote, because the issue of abortion has been one of the key issues which resonates with them in this election. Fairly different constituencies for the two. And at the moment, pretty evenly, it seems evenly divided. In terms of policies, again, a very different vision. Trump plays on anxieties and fears about the ongoing demographic transition in the United States. Even though whites are 67% of the population in America today, there is this underlying anxiety that 2 decades hence or whatever, will there be a demographic transition to a more diverse United States? So Trump plays on these anxieties and fears in terms of the salience which he gives to the whole illegal immigration issue. And even if what he says about eating dogs and cats may not be factually correct, the point is it plays into these anxieties about the US getting overwhelmed by foreigners coming in from outside who are changing the nature of the United States. Kamala has tried to posit a more optimistic view of the US. Immigration has been her weak point, but because it's come down in the last 6 months, the actual amount of illegal immigration into the US has come down in the last 6 months, and because Trump killed the bipartisan bill which would have funded border security agencies and officials who give decisions on political asylum applications and would have made it easier to deal with border infrastructure, was killed by Trump because the House turned it down. Republicans in the House turned it down. This is a talking point which he has used to rebut the accusations of having been soft on illegal immigration. The economy, of course, is the issue which has been the most important for all Americans. And Trump has made this a point of criticism. But if you look objectively at the way the economy performed during the Trump administration and during the Biden administration, it's been on par. Biden has had growth despite having inherited high inflation, a post-COVID economy with very high levels of inflation. It was 7%, I think, when Trump left. And economists give him good marks for having finally tamed inflation without going into recession, with the US economy still growing. I think the economy grew at an average of 2.3% or something during Trump's term, and it's grown at 2.2% during Biden's term. In terms of unemployment, Trump had good unemployment figures till the COVID crisis hit, when unemployment spiraled. Biden has had a good record on unemployment, brought it down to about 3.5 or something percent. Now it's gone up in recent weeks to over 4%. So unemployment is no longer such a major issue, but inflation has been the pain point for most Americans, with it touching a high of 9% during Biden's term, but it's now come down to 2.5%. So overall, I would say that Biden's handling of the economy has been fairly skillful. It's been the most successful in the developed world, but there have been pain points for ordinary people in terms of inflation and the cost of living. And because of the tight, high interest rates introduced by the Fed, it meant that average people have to pay more on their house mortgages. So this has been an issue, but the Fed has now started reducing interest rates. So maybe this cycle will continue. Kamala has said she will have an opportunity economy. She wants to build an opportunity economy. And she's promised to increase taxes, corporate taxes, income tax, but for Americans earning more than $400,000. She's also promised to, increase child tax credits, provide a bonus of $6,000 for, the firstborn child, provide incentives for first-time homeowners, provide up to $50,000 in tax credits for small businesses. So really looking at, providing incentives to the middle class, lower middle class, and working class. Economists feel, and Trump, on the other hand, wants to continue his tax cuts. He's also threatened tariffs of 10 to 20% across the board on all imports into the US, which would, of course, include India, and punitive tariffs, much beyond that, on imports from China. Last time he was there, we faced action on steel and aluminum imports from India, unilateral duties, withdrawal of GSP, case in the WTO to withdraw India's developing country status. And because he tightened up legal immigration and visas, much more difficulty for our software companies to send experts to the US for IT. So I do see that, trade frictions could become sharper if Trump is there. If Harris is there, you would expect a continuation of the existing policies. We've managed to resolve 6 to 7 WTO disputes bilaterally on the basis of mutual consensus. So trade frictions have not had the salience under the Democrats as they had under Trump. If you look at the strategic partnership with India and, of course, the relationship with China, which would be critical as far as both the US and India are concerned, I think this is one issue on which both Democrats and Republicans agree, that they see China as a major strategic competitor to the United States, the one country which has both the intention and the capability to challenge the US. The question is, how do they want to deal with it? Biden has continued the tariffs that Trump had placed on Chinese economic, certain section of Chinese exports to the US. He's also increased them recently and has, especially on electric cars and solar panels and so on. And he's tightened sanctions on export of high technology. So more pinpointed action, particularly in terms of semiconductors and the design and technology for semiconductors and high tech. Trump will increase punitive tariffs on China. In the strategic realm, Biden has been more institutional in terms of building the coalitions and partnerships to create this balance which would hedge in China, in Asia. So you have raising the Quad to summit level, you have AUKUS, you have renegotiating the defense agreement with the Philippines, you have the US-China, US-Japan, South Korea trilateral, and you have the effort to engage Europe as well, to engage NATO, to persuade them to look at China in a more strategic context rather than just as an economic opportunity, which is the way Europe was looking at China. They were about to sign an investment treaty. I would say Biden's efforts have been partially successful in bringing the Europeans on board. So a more institutional way to deal with China. but at the same time, a willingness to dialogue with China to try to stabilize the relationship and avoid inadvertent military conflict. With Trump, he's not so institutional, but he did resurrect Quad and raise it to ministerial level. So hopefully he will not challenge, Quad, because he can always claim ownership of the idea of reviving it. In terms of the bilateral, and also, the credibility of the US defense umbrella to some extent comes into question in a possible Trump presidency, because he has raised very fundamental questions. What are our troops doing in Japan and South Korea? They should not be there, or these countries should pay us more. More recently, Taiwan should pay us via, for helping to defend them and so on. So the credibility of the US defense umbrella to some extent comes into question. As far as India-US bilateral is concerned, you have, I think both will try to build the relationship with India. Trump, as I said, would be harsher on trade and perhaps more transactional. I have a little worry about the defense relationship, because last time he was very, as I said, he was keen on exporting defense equipment, but not so much on technology collaboration or on joint production. So the whole defense tech, he did, for instance, give India the strategic partner category 1, star 1 authorization in follow-up of Obama's decision to give India major, defense partner status. So that export front is fine, but he's dragged his feet on the defense technology and trade initiative, didn't have meetings for a very long time, and it kind of was just limping along by the end. So now you have the joint production of the F414 engine between GE and HAL. You have this whole initiative on critical and emerging technologies, where the latest decision announcement was that there will be an agreement to jointly produce semiconductors in India, which will have security and defense applications. And this will be with the US Space Force, so that's a government organization, and 2 private sector companies, one from India, one from the US. So fairly major announcements. I am not sure what continuity, I won't say whether that there could be a disruption, but there could be questions in a Trump administration about collaborative arrangements on technology and co-production. So I think we have to wait and see. But overall, I think the strategic thrust of the relationship, the growth of the economic relationship, I think this is going to continue. In terms of world crises, on Ukraine, Trump was asked specifically if he will support Ukraine to win the war. And he said, I will work with Ukraine to end the war. Of course, he would be hedged in by the majorities in the House of Representatives and by the Senate. Depending on what the composition of this is, his ability to stop aid to Ukraine may be hemmed in a bit, but he will certainly not pursue the conflict with Ukraine with the vigor that the Biden administration has shown. So you could see space opening up for negotiations. In Gaza, Trump would perhaps give a freer hand to Israel. And now, given that Iran has also been called out for having tried to assassinate Trump, whether he will take harsher action against Iran remains to be seen. By and large, I would say India is in a good place, but still there will be differences arising from the different domestic policy approaches and foreign policy approaches of the two candidates. Climate change would be an area where, again, there would be differences, with Trump giving permission for drilling in Alaska. He's not reiterated that he's walking out of the Paris Agreement, but last time he had done so. It would be a huge setback to global climate change efforts. I'll rest there. So.
Thank you, Ambassador, for such a comprehensive outlay of the picture. I want to come back to some of the points, but in the interest of time, I'll straight away go to Leslie. But let me, it was an interesting point made by you on the handling of the economy. The skillful handling of the economy, while by numbers it certainly seems that that's the case. I mean, bringing down roughly around, that was inflation that was hovering around 30% to right now to 2.5%. But if you talk to the Republicans, it is exactly on the handling of the economy that the Republicans are voting how they are. But let me move to Leslie. Thank you for joining so early, and you're perhaps closest to the Trump Tower than any of us. In terms of foreign policy agenda of the next administration, how do you parse the difference or similarities between the two, particularly transatlantic relations and China? I'm sure we've heard a lot, but anything that you would want to add there?
Yeah, first of all, just say, let me say it's wonderful to be not exactly with you in the same room, but to be able to see all of you. It's really delightful for me. I value my annual trips to the Rosina Dialogue more than just about any other diplomatic conference, and I'm really looking forward to it. So, but it's nice in the interim to be able to see you online. So thank you. I'm just going to say a couple of words about the domestic before I answer your question. I'm in New York City right now. I've just come from a few days in Chicago, and before that I was in the now famous Omaha, Nebraska, the state that is one of two states in the nation that splits its electoral college vote. I arrived, I grew up in Omaha. I was visiting for personal reasons. I take a deep interest in the political always. I arrived just a few days after Senator Lindsey Graham was there as part of a Republican effort to press domestic state-level legislators in the Republican Party to support an initiative to change the electoral law quickly so that Nebraska consolidates its electoral college votes to a winner-take-all system, which is how the other 48 states, minus Nebraska and Maine, operate. And that, I think, is very telling, primarily because we're only really talking about the risk of the Republicans losing that one vote, which is really centered around Omaha, which has split only twice before, broke for the Democrats away from the rest of the state. But it gives you a sense of just how fraught and just how tight this election is perceived to be at this moment. We know this from the polls. They're not all the same, but on average, they do show an incredibly close race, especially in those swing states, which is really rather remarkable, given we've got two very different candidates, one of whom is extremely well known, and for many Americans, a very deeply problematic candidate, not only on the policy ground, but simply on the grounds of the insurrection on the Capitol on January 6th. And yet we're facing an election that is actually, I know you said less than 50 days. I think actually we're now less than 40 days. I mean, I wrote it down the other day and my heart started to, go into palpitations. It really is the battle for the future of the direction of the United States. I won't necessarily say democracy, and I want to say a word about that, but it is when you start to see Republicans flying to Nebraska and pushing for that one vote, you know that things are incredibly close. A couple comments on what was said before. I thought the comments have been brilliant, and the remark about some of the dividing lines in America's democracy. In this election, I just want to underscore 53% of white Americans are leaning towards Donald Trump and the Republicans in this election. But even more remarkably, or I guess it gives you a sense of what's at stake, when you look at the composition of the minority and white vote in the swing states, if you look at the three that we tend to talk about the most, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, one of those states is just under 80% white voters, and the other two are just over. So you're talking about states in which, although the white vote splits, it leans towards the Republicans, and it's 80% of that vote is white. So turning out white voters is incredibly important in the swing states for both parties. The white voter base for Donald Trump's Republican Party is very enthusiastic about their candidate and much more likely to turn out and vote, and the Democrats understand this. The minority voters that lean heavily Democrat in the swing states are also much less likely to turn out and vote. So a lot of what we're seeing now in the campaign is not really about persuading people of who to support. It's about maintaining a level of interest and enthusiasm for what's at stake in the election, for how significantly different the policies are, and especially, I would argue, for the character and quality of the individual candidate. And it's hard to measure in a poll. We know that the polls tell us that voters care about economic policy, in other words, prices, AKA inflation. We know that they care about immigration. We know that the policies, but I would argue that in fact, so much of this race is about identity and whether people have confidence and feel confidence in their candidate. And that cuts both ways. For those who might really be opposed to having a Democratic candidate, they're very anti-Bidenomics. They think the state is intervening too much in the economy. They're concerned about the inflationary tendencies of the Democratic Party. They're relatively moderate, but they're also deeply concerned about Donald Trump's stability. There's a kind of assessing the quality and the stability of the Republican candidate. I think for Democratic voters, or those who are sort of maybe thinking about peeling away, or some of those undecided voters, there's a question of who she really is. We like to say continuity. I'm not so persuaded that within a year and a half of a Kamala Harris presidency, it would be as much about continuity as we now think it is. She's in a very difficult position. She's a sitting vice president. So of course she's got to demonstrate continuity, but we might start to see more change over time were she to be elected and sort of freed of that number two spot. But people are looking at her, trying to see, do they trust her? Do they believe that she has what it takes to lead? Or does she have the policy depth? I think that's actually much less important for most voters at this point in time. And we haven't talked about the fact that she is an Indian American woman. She is an African, a Black woman, not African. And for a lot of white voters, this will be deeply troubling to see a female of Asian and Black heritage. It's something that is remote from their own personal identity. And when you start again to talk about that, roughly 80% of white voters in swing states and needing to get them out to vote, that is a very significant factor in this election, I would argue. For many people, it's a huge bonus. For many minority voters, the enthusiasm for Kamala Harris is very significant. So getting them to vote is really critical for the Democratic Party. And I think we can't understate that whole female plus minority in a context of a still pretty moderate and in some ways very macho country, especially I think in the swing states. So this is a tough road for a candidate who's only really just burst onto the stage despite having been vice president a very, very difficult task for her and her party. The second thing I would say about that is what you see in both campaigns is really a push to demonstrate that they are the better candidate for the middle class. And, you know, when we say middle class in the United States context, as you know, we're really in a, you know, I live in London normally. It's sort of it's the working class. It's not what we think of as the British middle class. It's really the working Americans. Can this woman or this man really speak to working class individuals? And here it's also a really strange context, because even though the policies that the Democrats are putting forward, Kamala Harris in particular, when it comes to taxes and spending, are very much playing to that middle class, but it's not necessarily being read that way. There's a disconnect between what's going into people's pocketbooks and how they assess whether or not the candidate is really acting in their interests. And that still seems to be leaning towards Donald Trump. So it is a phenomenally tight race, and the stakes, I would argue, are extremely high, most especially for the United States. And there is this broader, we know that there's been a big debate about democracy in America. I would argue that it's, you know, the institutions in the US are certainly, you know, there's a lot at stake with the institutions. We've seen that over the last many years. But there's a broader question of just sort of stability, unity, and functionality, even setting aside the question of democracy. Just having a stable, functioning state is something that's very much at issue in this election, because of, I think, the chaos that was experienced during the first Trump presidency, culminating obviously in January 6th. And so there's a real question there. The other thing I would point out that maybe hasn't been discussed is we're heading into what's likely to be a very unstable transitional moment. Very few people that I talk to, and I'd be curious to hear from others, very few people that I talk to think that this election will be resolved in the 24 or so hours after November 5th, the Tuesday election. Most people think that it will go on for a period of time, that there are likely to be swing state results that are contested, we hope through the courts, as has happened in the past. And there's been a real push to alter the locus of authority and power for navigating and making a judgment on those state level potentially contested elections. And that's been in process behind the scenes for quite a long time. So there's a huge amount just in the transition. And I think it's extremely important for international audiences, and especially for international leaders, to have their plan in place for how to engage directly with the US that might be in a very difficult position, uncertain position, and also for how to potentially react to any states or provocateurs that choose to take advantage of an America that is in a very difficult transition. And I think, again, I can't stress enough, we'll hope that that's the dog that doesn't bark, that doesn't happen, that this is a very smooth, peaceful transition from President Biden to whoever comes next. But I don't think that we should assume it or count on it. And that raises the bar for America's partners and allies when it comes to navigating and managing stability generally, not only within the US, but internationally. Really, really critical time for international relations. Let me just say a couple of brief words on the issues that have been so thoughtfully discussed. I do think I'm of the view, some people are of the view that there will be more continuity than discontinuity regardless of who's elected. I think that that's true in some cases. We just finished a trip across to Asia. We were in Singapore, Seoul, and Tokyo. Before that in Mexico and Brazil. And we've obviously been in many conversations in Europe to talk about key issues in America's bilateral relations as we approach the election. We were quite struck by the level of pragmatism across the parts of Asia that we visited. And frankly, even in Mexico, where you would expect a level of concern about possible deportations if Trump is elected, and a much tougher and harsher border policy, as well as potentially the use of tariffs in a way that would be very difficult. But there was even a level of pragmatism in Mexico. This is not the case, I would argue, in Europe, where the level of concern and the sense of gravity of what this election means for America's, let alone defense of Ukraine, America's Russia policy, and what that will mean for Europe. Given that most Europeans, or many Europeans, do not believe that, and we can debate whether this is true, but many Europeans do not believe that Putin's ambitions are limited to Ukraine. So it's existential for many Europeans, the outcome of this election, not only because of what we all know about Donald Trump's antipathy towards the amount of spending that Americans have committed to Ukraine and doesn't want to go any further down that road, but also because of this sort of unknown sense that that Donald Trump has a deep feeling of friendliness towards Vladimir Putin. And so it's very uncertain what America's Russia policy would be. And that's sort of a much bigger question, and one that I think is probably right up there at the top of the things that would be very different between the two candidates. America's policy, not only towards Europe, we know that Donald Trump never really liked Germany. He certainly doesn't like the European Union. He still feels like there's a lot of free riding going on, the return to tariffs at a different level, the pushback on Germany, on the European Union, but also this very significant question of what would America's Russia policy be, not only during this period of hot war between Russia and Ukraine, but after. And that, I think, is a really existential question for Europeans. The second thing I'd say that we haven't really mentioned is, we know that one of the biggest issues right now that needs to be navigated globally, if not internationally, is the governance questions around artificial intelligence. And here, I think the parties have quite different instincts. You hear from Kamala Harris the conversation about the potential opportunities of AI, but you hear a lot about the risks and a lot about having a governance regime that takes into account some of the inequalities that come out of AI. So far as I understand it, and again, this is, I think, is a work in progress, the Republicans have a very different attitude towards AI. They're very much focused on the opportunity, the innovation, and backing off the regulation. And that would certainly put the US and Europe in a different position, but it raises all sorts of questions about the future of that technology, which is going to possibly radically redefine our international relations in the next 0 to 10 years. I guess the other thing I would say, and I'm not going to go on case by case because we've heard so much of that so nicely, but I do think that the overall tenor of the administration, even if some of the policies remain similar, the overall tenor of a Trump administration would be one that's more vocally nationalist, America first, and that's more vocally, and here I think the policies would differ too, very much more about that agenda being manifest in economic policy, made in America being absolutely critical. We've seen that Donald Trump is proposing a different level of corporate tax rate for those companies that would commit, a much lower rate for those that would commit to making much of their products in the United States. We'd see, I think, a return to a higher level of focus on tariffs. We've heard the talk of potentially 60% tariffs on China. That's very significant. We'd see much more pressure on Taiwan because of that battle over semiconductor production. He's very angry. Donald Trump is very angry at semiconductors being manufactured in Taiwan. We can expect that to affect the overall thinking on security policy. There's diversity across the people who might support a Trump administration. We know that Bridge Colby is kind of staunch on focusing America's foreign policy efforts towards Taiwan in particular, in the Indo-Pacific. But Donald Trump is not necessarily on the same page. So there's a lot at stake. I think that the differences are potentially very significant. I guess one word on India, I tend to agree with what most people say, that the bipartisan commitment on the part of the US leaders across the aisle towards India is phenomenally strong. I'm very glad about that. It's getting stronger, it's getting deeper and richer, and more connected. And China is probably the most important reason, but it's only one reason. There's an identity argument that underpins this. There's a fondness, which is quite extraordinary to see Modi's visit with Biden. However, and this is where I get quite nervous, were Donald Trump to take the helm of managing this relationship, he doesn't really like following in the footsteps of his Democratic predecessors. So I think the fact that Biden and Modi have been so close and so visibly so close would probably create some degree of, of a President Trump wanting to draw a little bit of distance for a period of time. Because the one thing that we saw in Donald Trump in term one was that, anything that he had inherited from the Democrats, he wanted to sort of undo, or he wanted to at least rebrand as his. And, there was one success in that area, I would argue, the renegotiation of NAFTA to the USMCA, a better deal. That's up for review. I hope and think that Trump would keep that because it was his. But the US-India relationship has been, while bipartisan in a US context, has really been owned very visibly by the Democrats and by Biden in particular. So I think that's a point of, that would be a point of temporary concern for India were Trump to be elected. There's so much more to say on China, on climate, on economic policy, but I think that those issues have been really very brilliantly laid out. So I'll stop there, but thanks for listening, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Leslie. Interesting points there, particularly the point at which you ended for all of us to ponder on what it could mean for India-US relations should Trump administration come to power. But also interesting that you mentioned NAFTA. I mean, it's at the center of a concern right now for particularly the Republicans who feel that there's been some loopholes inside NAFTA, which has been exploited by China to reroute its own goods through its own deals with Mexico. Now, I'll leave that. We're running short of time, so I'll open this up for Q&A. Please keep your questions brief and directed to specific panelists. And also, please introduce yourselves. Yes.
My name is Harsh Thakur. I'm from Hindu College. So, a brief few questions. Firstly, how do we see this context, like the American debt? It's rising and it's currently at some $35 trillion, and it's the elephant in the room. So how do we see this debt being addressed by either of the governments, if at all they arise? Point one. Second question is, we have seen both the Democrats and the Republicans speaking about marijuana deregulation in Florida, and Republicans have never been for it. So is there a sentiment in the public that the marijuana has to be legalized? And third, but the last question, Tim Walz has his China connection. And since China is a major issue right now in the American discourse, the question is, how far is it affecting the voters? That's it. Thank you.
I'll take a bunch before passing it on.
Leslie, I want to ask you a very basic question about a US election. Why in last 250 years, women have not been elected, and rest of the world, we had so many women, president and prime minister. And second thing, you are a high-tech country. You use all types of technology, but why don't you use this election machine like India we are using for so many years? And third thing about cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency is a very huge, or $30 trillion is a parallel economy. That's my question. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Pavan. My question is, in fact, directed to Mr. Nicholas or Ms. Leslie. This is regarding, in fact, the keyword in American democracy is national security. How it is being paid out to the local people, and how it is going to affect the election results when it finally comes out. Thank you.
Thank you. We can go to the answers and come back to the next round. Leslie, do you want to start?
So I'd be happy to take a stab at that. Why aren't we using high tech in the election like India and other states? I mean, it's a great question. I personally think the answer is our country, and what's interesting is the United States at the level of the people is less polarized than people think it is. It's highly polarized, as we all know, at the political level. And so high tech, high tech is not just high tech, it's political. And there are reasons not to wish to see everybody vote for certain parties because of the demographic shifts that we heard about earlier. And so there's a lot of political mobilization around the mechanics of how you vote, how you count votes, how you contest votes, early voting, voting on the day, voting by mail, voting in person. These things are deeply, deeply partisan and political. If voting on the day only tends to favor Republicans, voting by mail, voting early tends to, the belief is that favors Democrats. So the idea of moving to a hyper rational, high functioning system is not a neutral thing to do. And given that elections are managed by states, where again, the partisan issues are very significant, the parties have a lot of contested power between them. The idea of just saying we're going to get this right is really, that is not where the debate is. The debate is about how do we win, and not necessarily by being more small d democratic. It's about how do we win by making sure that our voters vote and that their votes get counted. It's sad, but it is a fact of American political life. On women, I mean, so if you look at American society, women are actually outnumber men in higher education as students. They outperform men in many of the most important fields globally. We have high levels of women in most sectors of society. We have large numbers of female leaders in the private sector, but it's very hard to crack the top role. And this election is historic for so many reasons. That is certainly one. But again, go back to the politics, go back to how voting takes place. And that, in my mind, tells you a lot about why you don't get a female. This is not a national, if this was a one vote, if this was just a national election, popular vote determining the leader, we would have had Hillary Clinton. Whatever you think, that's what we would have had. We know that from the votes. So we would be talking at least about, the second possible candidate, and Kamala Harris is undoubtedly going to win the popular vote, but that's not how the politics work. I'm going to kind of not say anything on cryptocurrency because you know so much more than I do. I don't know. I mean, I'm going to let somebody else take that question. And on China, voters care about China. It's not driving the vote. I think China policy will be very different depending on who takes office. But I think that the level of kind of anger or palpable emotions surrounding China was especially high during COVID because of the view by many Americans that China was to blame. And then the wolf, what was dubbed the wolf warrior tactics and the clamping down on Hong Kong, there were a whole series of factors that made China really palpably, viscerally felt China policy for many Americans. That I think that sort of abated a bit. And we know foreign policy is on the ballot. It's in the debates. People are talking about it, thinking about it, but it's not going to likely drive their vote. However, it will certainly drive policy after the election. But maybe somebody else can take up crypto.
Yeah. Thank you. Ambassador Shankar, do you want to come in?
Yeah, on the American debt, you were talking about that. I think economists say that both Kamala's policies and Trump's policies will increase the burden of debt on the United States, but that Kamala's policies will probably increase it less than Trump's, because when asked how he proposes to fund, because Kamala is at least proposing to raise taxes, corporate taxes, taxes for those who earn over $400,000 and so on, to fund some of her programs. But Trump is saying that I will pay for it through the tariffs that I impose and the money I collect from the tariffs. And on housing, which is an issue for a lot of people, he says he will facilitate housing because he will be deporting illegal immigrants. So then a pool of housing will be available. Clearly, he's not thought through how he's going to do it beyond the tax cuts that he's talking about. So I think American debt is likely to increase, but perhaps less under Kamala than under Trump. As far as China is concerned, I don't think Walz's connection with China will matter in the election. Actually, it's going to be issues such as the economy, and particularly inflation, immigration, abortion, I think, which are going to be the key issues on which voters are going to be, making their decisions, and identity. Because even if you look at the polls, Trump is given higher marks on handling the economy than Kamala. But in terms of character and capability to be the mental makeup to be president, Kamala is given much higher marks than Trump. So there are factors weighing in favor of either candidate, but where it's finally going to end, I think only the American voters will know. What will be interesting is if there's a tie. If there is a tie in the swing states and no one gets the 270 seats required in the final electoral college, then there's a contingent election, and it goes to the House of Representatives to choose the president on 6 January probably, and to the Senate to choose the vice president. So again, it could be, it can be pretty tumultuous, and which way it's going to go, you really don't know. So irrespective of the outcome, I think there will be, as Lisa said, a period of instability till, the picture kind of sorts itself out, because Trump, even if he loses, is not going to accept the election without challenge. And on the other hand, if his victory is by a narrow margin, it's possible the Democrats challenge it, So it's a very fluid situation right now. Pardon?
Cryptocurrency.
I won't want to talk about cryptocurrency.
Suhasini,
It's
do you
not
want to
so
comment on
important,
something?
except that Trump is now venturing, has started his own business on crypto.
Nicholas, there was a question directed to you, so if you want to comment.
Yeah, I'll talk about the national security and local people. I think it comes into play in kind of 3 or 4 areas. One is immigration policy. People see national security as immigration policy. And then that can also tie into local crime issues. And so how they vote based on those issues, they kind of tie some of that. Some voters tie that into national security. 2 is terrorism. You see a couple Pew research report polling this year. Terrorism is still a high issue for Americans. The Israel-Palestine issue kind of draws that out even more, the terrorism aspect and how Americans see terrorism as a national security issue still. And then also with the military and how we're going to use our military in Ukraine, and then how to deal with the China challenge. Again, those aren't high issues. It's more the immigration issue as a national security issue that's going to be a voting factor versus the military and China factor. And then lastly, national security is technology. Are we allowed to use TikTok or Facebook, or are our accounts being hacked by unknown actors, known actors? Those are where I think many local people, Americans outside Washington, D.C., see national security.
Thank you. Last week, Trump walked into a bar and offered everybody that around the room, around the bar, some hamburgers and drinks. And finally, when it came to paying, he paid in crypto. So there's definitely a Republican embrace to crypto regulation and others. But beyond that, let me open this up for a second and perhaps a final round. Yes, please.
So my name is Vikrant. I'm from EY. So my question to all the panelists over here, what's the view and how they're going to tackle this Israel-Palestine conflict, either under Harris or Trump, and the escalation of war which is going on in Ukraine as well?
Ukraine, everybody touched.
Hello, I'm Abhay Gandwara. Dr. Leslie would know me, I believe. She would recognize me. I was a student. Okay, so my question actually is directed to her as well. So, statistically speaking, whilst a lot of the states, American states, have been actually growing the economy accordingly, but the swing states, particularly I would say the blue wall states, have not been growing the economy. The domestic economy has been very lessened. In fact, Pennsylvania, out of 68 or 69 counties, almost 51 counties actually have lost their jobs from 2019 to 2023. And at the same time, so that actually brings up a question that if what Harris is doing by unionizing, or rather, promoting the government intervention on economy is actually based on the blue collar jobs, because whilst these jobs are being lost in these blue wall states, most of the jobs lost are particularly focusing on the working class, especially the blue collar jobs.
My question is to Nicholas. Hi, I'm Vivek. My question is to Nicholas. So, in last few elections, we have seen that there has been noticeable external influence on US election. So, has US done anything to check that external influence? Thank you.
I'll just take the first two questions. One on Republicans for Harris is an interesting question, simply because obviously 95% of this election is already done. Everybody knows how they're going to vote. It's not changing. Because of the way the US election system works, we already know where the electoral college is. So that's why it's down to these swing states. And I've even read analysis that says it's actually just down to Pennsylvania, or or one single state kind of thing. Why the concept of Republicans for Harris is interesting is because it involves the idea that somebody may be able to attract voters of another side. The other reason it's interesting is because during the midterms in 2022, President Biden was able to rack up considerable, shore up considerable Democrat votes, simply because women who may have otherwise identified as Republican either stayed home and didn't vote over the abortion question, over the Roe v. Wade being overturned. I think in this election, they did try, certainly at the DNC, to bring that up again. And there are ads out there saying if Trump comes to power, he will push for a national ban on abortion. That hasn't really flown because Trump himself in the debates has denied it. But if they're able to, between now and November, get some kind of a sort of issue where they can cut through the Republican vote bank and divide them on the basis of gender identity or other identities, then you might see actually the Republican for Harris thing meaning something. Otherwise, it's a nice slogan, and we see them at all the events. And on Israel and Palestine, I think what we might have to contend with is the American election itself. The election process may have an impact on what's to follow. What we have seen, and this is across the board in the US, is a consistent enablement of the Israeli prime minister to continue his bombing of Gaza and now to broaden the war into Lebanon. And what Israel is essentially saying is, we will attack anywhere where we see guns pointed at us, because that is now part of our right to defend ourselves. By that logic, frankly, every country around the world can start bombing another, because most borders do see guns pointed at you. But just watching this kind of enablement and the idea for that for the next few weeks, America is going to be more preoccupied with its election than perhaps in curtailing Netanyahu, which again is seen as a vote loser if you're seen in any way, and not supporting Israel. I think we have to really worry about whether the fact that everyone is preoccupied with the election is just going to give the Israeli prime minister enough space to broaden this war to the point where America itself may not be able to reverse it. My sense is the reason for today's combined joint statement by President Biden and French President Macron, really urging Israel to stop in its tracks and think about what it's doing, is because this can actually really blow up. The world has watched Israel's bombardment of Gaza, 40,000 lives, 15,000 children, and so far not really been, all we see the reaction to it is in maybe Anga votes. The US, that's what I mean. So what we're seeing now is a kind of space for Israel to broaden this conflict to a point where the US may have to actually worry about it a lot more. So what I'm trying to say is that it may not matter whether Trump or Harris come to power. Once they come to power, they might be dealing with a whole new phase of that particular conflict.
Sorry.
There's still two questions.
On Republicans for Harris, these are Republicans mostly who were with the Bush administration, and the Republican Party has been refashioned in the image of Trump. So mostly they are people who were influential, who were decision makers in the Bush administration, and also many in the first Trump administration, but currently are really on the margins or fringes of the Republican mainstream. And you have seen Trump's hold on the Republican Party, which I would liken not to a political leader, but to a religious cult figure. It's almost like that. And therefore, the Republican Party really is very different to the traditional conservative Republican Party of George Bush. And whether what those officials say will have an impact on, Americans is a question. But what it does show is that Kamala does have an ability to try to reach across the aisle to opinion which may not be fully aligned with hers. And that, I think, is something which America sorely needs at this stage. They need less polarization. They need to be able to find some common ground and not look at, political competitors as adversaries. You see it in a lot of countries across the world now because of this, governance in the age of 24-hour social media, which tends to, absolutely polarize opinion.
We're past time, but Nicholas and Leslie, final words to you, starting with Nicholas, please.
Thank you. Just quickly on the external influences, it's not it's still a worry, but it's not a big factor as it was in the previous election. I think the parties themselves have tried to shore up some of their defenses on external influences, and the candidates and campaigns as well, to try to shore up their defenses of external influences, and then try to say external influences are trying to get the other candidate to win. And then on the Israel-Palestine and Ukraine wars, both candidates will, if either of them win, will have sections of their party encouraging them to end the wars. But the support for Israel and the support for Ukraine is already there, and that sort of will have to be factored in, and we'll have to get to a point where both the president will have to find a spot where Israel seems okay with the end of the war, and Ukraine seems okay with it. And that's a tough thing to do, especially as Ms. Haidar said, the dynamics will probably be dramatic, if not dramatically changed, then significantly changed by the time the new president takes office. Thanks again for everybody.
Leslie?
Yeah, I'll be quick. This has been tremendous discussion. I've really enjoyed listening to the speakers and the questions. It's wonderful to see a SOAS alum amongst you. There's so many SOAS alums in India. I am particularly heartened and thrilled to see one of my former students. Please keep coming back. The push for blue, as I understood the question, Kamala Harris is absolutely committed and trying to persuade blue-collar voters and unions, which are critical in those swing states, that her policies are speaking to them when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to childcare, when it comes to her tax policy, when it comes to any number of economic benefits. But it's difficult to get that to translate. Even though the rate of inflation has come down, we've now seen that reflected in the highest levels of economic policy. That still hasn't fully translated into how people feel. So it is, but you're right that is because of the way the voting system works, because of the importance of white voters in swing states, many of whom are blue collar. That is critical. The point about the election is 95% done. Absolutely. Boy, does the part that's not been decided matter. And it's not, and I'll just say it again, it's not just who they intend to vote for, it's whether they do it. And a lot of people intend to vote and then they just sort of don't. And so it's not a preference selection. It's primarily, there are undecideds. It's even more about people turning out and voting and their votes being counted. And that's where it's not a structural problem. It is just about individual human agency. On Israel and Palestine, I think it's absolutely right. This is a situation that's moving fast. It's phenomenally fraught. The human consequences are devastating. But I think there's a very significant difference between the two leaders. And Donald Trump is if there's anything that he holds clearly and powerfully and strongly, it's America's commitment to Israel. He has a very strong base in evangelical supporters, which are very committed to Israel. His donor base is very committed to Israel. And as we have seen hints, that Kamala Harris has a different view. Obviously, she's constrained, but I think the Democratic Party has a much broad, the only thing that's really holding the Democratic Party together right now is its intense, singular desire to see Donald Trump defeated. If and when that happens, the divisions within that party will reemerge, and a big division within that party is over Israel. And we've seen the recent pieces that have come out detailing the division within the Biden administration on America's support for Israel during the war in Gaza. And that is just, I think, the tip of the iceberg on what might play out. So I think this is going to be a very significant space and a very different one across the two parties. So much so much to talk about. External influence matters. It's a really big problem. It's going to continue to be a problem, but I fully agree. The real problem when it comes to disinformation, Americans don't need any help. We're so good at creating misinformation, disinformation, messing with votes, fighting amongst ourselves. We're just phenomenal at this. Like, never mind. It's not, I don't mean to downplay the problem of disinformation and misinformation from external actors, but boy, we do that extremely well ourselves. So we have a very resilient set of institutions, and we have a lot of people that are incredibly patriotic across the aisle and are committed and want a highly functioning economy in which they can be very financially and economically successful for themselves and their children. That part of the American dream is alive and well. And that is probably the thing that will save America, because you got to have stability and functioning institutions to make that work. But the level of division cannot and should not be underestimated. It is a tough time, and we are not planning on getting much sleep over the next few months. So stay with us, and I look forward to seeing everybody in the months ahead.
Thank you so much. That's a perfect note to end on. Thank you all for coming today. I know we're leaving the room with quite a few questions unanswered, but that's a good sign of the debate we've had. And we've tried to thread the needle and look at the crystal ball, but I think we came out with some answers and we didn't for some others. But thank you, Leslie and Nicholas, for joining so early and staying with us through. Look forward to seeing you again. And thank you to the two panelists who've come in person. Thank you to the audience.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.